Hello and welcome to another event in our Tech Talk series. Today's presentation will cover Visualforce components. As you may know, Salesforce.com is a publicly traded company, and therefore we do need to share this safe harbor statement with you to let you know that any forward-looking statements are just that, forward-looking statements. If you'd like to learn more about the safe harbor statement, you can find it on our website under the Investor Relations section. So with that, I would like to introduce Ron Hess.
Hello, thank you, Sheridan. Hi, my name is Ron Hess, and today with my colleague, Andrew Waite, we're going to cover Visualforce components. Now, we're going to start with a quick overview of Visualforce and components, how they fit together. And for those of you that attended Andrew's presentation at Dreamforce 2008, we'll cover some of the same stuff, but we've also tried to update it to cooperate some of the feedback we got from that session, as well as covering some advanced topics. Andrew's going to cover delegation and repeating components a little bit later on. And one of the things that we like to do with these Tech Talk webinars is to allow you to bring your questions and get your questions answered. We'll answer as many questions as possible today. So if while we cover the review material up front here, if you have a few moments to compose your question, please go ahead and type it into the chat window, and we will collect all of those and answer them towards the end. So first, I just want to introduce Visualforce. If you're not familiar with Visualforce, then please take a moment to go back after this webinar and review the Visualforce webinar that's available on our website, developer.force.com. As you know, Visualforce is based on the popular design pattern called Model View Controller. And what we're going to talk about today, the components, fall into the view portion. In addition, components can take advantage of Apex and therefore custom controllers. But we'll be focusing today on the interaction of the page and the view and a little bit of controller. So just to recap what Visualforce is, it's the canvas where all of the user interface is generated. And we're going to be discussing components, and all of the components that we talk about are presented eventually on a Visualforce page. So you do need to understand Visualforce pages. There is another webinar you can review to catch up on that. So what are components? Well, you've seen these many times in the CRM application. They're reusable user interface elements, and some with their own input behaviors. For example, the date input or the salutation pull-down list, that's actually a component. One that we provide for you, Apex Input Field. The basic and a few advanced components are built in for you. That's in the standard component library. But if you're listening to this webinar, you're probably interested in writing your own components. So we're going to press on and get to that very soon. So why build a custom component? Well, a custom component, the primary reason to go through the exercise building a custom component is to achieve some reuse. This allows you to have a component on several pages, but avoid repeating the source code for that component. They also allow you to achieve easier maintenance, since fixes or changes made in the component appear in every page where the component is used. So custom components represent what we like to call smart includes. Why is that different than using Apex Include? Well, you certainly can use Apex Include to include one page inside of another page. But what you don't get with that model is you don't get the ability for the page author to specify attributes, attributes, behaviors, or parameters that the component might want to use. This drawing here doesn't show us passing anything in, but the idea is that a component gives you the flexibility to do more than Apex Include allows. So, for example, we have, in this case, one component that we'd like to use in several places on the page. To do this, we have a basic component that displays a list of links and a title. But we want to use it in several different ways on the page. And so what we're allowing is, with the component, you can pass in information like what should the title be and what should the background color be. So you can use one component to achieve several different looks. And again, this allows you to reduce your code maintenance chore and still achieve the flexibility that you need. So we're going to start by looking at the Hello World component. It's a very simple component. We'll step through a short demo, and then I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to go into some of the deep technical topics. So this Hello World component has a component tag which defines all components, and it has a single attribute. The attribute is called name, and once you pass in a name, the component is going to combine that with some user interface, in this case the word hello, and it's going to combine that with the parameter passed in, and it's going to present the hello world. So let's go ahead and switch over to the live browser here. Okay, so here we have the page, Hello World, and it's calling a component called Hello World, and we're passing in the attribute world. So let's take a quick look at the component itself and what it's doing. So again, this is a very simple component. As you can see, it accepts an attribute called name, and it then uses an expression to combine that with some user interface that's inside the component, and that's the word hello on line 5. So we can have we can change this to show hello webinar. So let's go ahead and change world to webinar and click save, and we should see hello webinar. Now the beauty of this is the component did not have to change, but it provides some portion of the user interface. This allows the page author some flexibility and allows the component author to accept attributes from the page author. So these two authors, the component author and the page author, they have a contract, and the contract is represented by the parameters that the component will accept. And you can even make these attributes required. So switching back to the slides, let's cover briefly some of the terms that we just saw. Apex component. This is similar to the Apex page tag, and it defines the component. You have to have this on every component, and it has some attributes like a controller and extensions. These are Apex classes that you'd like to use inside the component. Then there's Apex attribute. Apex attribute defines the attributes that can be specified by the consumer. Now consumer is another word for the page author. So Andrew will use this because it's a technical term. I like page author. They both mean the same thing, and allows us to pass in information to the component. Component body allows for the page author and the component author to work together. The component author can provide a default user interface, but the page author can actually use the component and specify their own user interface. So we will see that in just a moment. Andrew's got a great example, demonstration of that. So we'll continue on. So we just saw the simple consumer page and the component definition, and what we saw was passing the attribute name. I also call them parameters from time to time, but it's really called an attribute, and it's got a type string and a description. Now the description is very interesting because the description actually allows us to generate self-documenting components. So once you install a component into an organization or your developer org or customer org, that component definition actually appears in the online help for the system. So if you go into the component reference, you'll see the custom components appear here. So this is basically self-documenting your component. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the pass-through binding. And for that, I'd like to introduce Andrew Waite, the product manager for Visualforce and Visualforce components, to take us through this next section, which will get a little more technical.
Thanks very much, Ron. So as you saw in the Hello World example, the user passed in a hard, discrete, literal value into the component, and the component used that value in its binding to output that information. In this example, what we're talking about is being able to build essentially a special input widget or element to capture information and provide that information back to whatever was passed into it. So in this case, the consumer page is bound to the standard controller for account, and it has an account record on it. That account record has a number of employees field on it. So as you can see, the custom component here is bound to account.number of employees. That binding is actually passed through to the component definition through its attribute of the same name value. And like we saw with the Hello World example, that value, instead of being passed through and just output, can be passed through into another input component, and that input can be captured and fed back to the originating object. This is all by reference, and these are pass-through expression bindings that allow you to build your own input elements, just like you can build an output element like Ron showed with Hello World. Let's take a look at this in a demonstration. So I've got a basic page here as it was before in the description on the slide, bound to the standard controller for account. This one has a little more information in it to make the presentation of the page look a little more friendly and common to what you'd find in Salesforce.com. We provide components that provide this look and feel. And we also have, as you saw in one of those previous slides, an input field component, which is our standard input component type for field definitions, in this case bound to account name. But this one is, underneath here, number of employees is now bound to input slider. Let's make this a little bigger so you can see it. So there's input slider there, as you saw on the slide. And it is bound to account number of employees. And it also provides a minimum value and a maximum value specification. Let's take a look at what that component definition looks like now. Okay, so underneath we can see the code for the page, and on top here we have the component. The component has two integer-typed attributes, minimum and maximum, as you see specified on the page below, values of 0 and 300, and a value that is an expression passed in from the input slider from the page author, the consumer of the component, into this custom component. I've included a number of style sheets, and including scripts, things that are provided from a library, a JavaScript library called EXTJS. This library stored in a static resource with the specifications provided by the API documentation for that JavaScript library. I'm leveraging all of that inside of Salesforce.com.
Now, Andrew, I have a question. When you include script inside your component, will those be combined into the head element of the page?
Yes, Ron. Actually, both style sheet and include script will be, those components will take the references, the values here, construct the URLs to the respective resources, and include those inside the head tag of the page in which the component is included. So here's a little script that is needed to get EXT running. And you can see that I've passed through, I've got an input text component here that does the heavy lifting of setting the value. And I've just passed through that same value attribute expression as you saw in the name value attribute expression on the Hello World when it was passed through. In this case, we're passing through a reference to the expression binding itself. So when that value is set, the object account and its property number of employees will be set according to whatever is put in there. And that is actually fed by the slider. And as you can see, the EXT component has min value and max value, and we're just passing those values in just like we did the value of the input expression. So if I go back now, I can create a new account, and I can specify the number of employees using my slider and save. And using the standard save provided by the standard controller, it will insert this account, and you can see number of employees as to the value that I specified there. So that is the input slider component, and just demonstrating how through pass-through binding expressions. You can build your own input elements that map to whatever information was passed into them from the consumer, in this case, the page author. Taking it to the next level, so far what we've seen in each of the two examples has had no real Apex really involved. In the last example, we had a standard controller provided by Salesforce for the account entity or account object, but really no Apex directly involved. Now we're going to talk about bringing that power of Apex into your Visualforce components through controllers. So just like a page can have a controller, components can also have a controller. Controllers contain the logic and data that a page uses. Allows you to separate the presentation, in this case in the form of a component, from the logic underneath the covers inside of the Apex controller. They are created in Apex code, providing full access to Apex functionality that includes the database itself, doing callouts, providing extensive algorithm support, and various things that might make it easier for your consumer of your component to work with that complex interaction. So Apex controllers for components themselves, again, expose these capabilities in Apex, that full access to the database in the form of DML operations or queries, search, sending of email, performing callouts to third-party web services, supporting complex algorithms, and just basically you can also use this to introduce Apex to Visualforce email templates. So with that, I want to show one more demonstration here, just that leverages the power of Apex to perform callouts. In this case, this component called RSS feed allows a user to include records or entries, rather, from any RSS feed through a feed burner and present them inside of Salesforce with a familiar look and feel. So let's take a look at that. So as this page loads, it's actually loading the component. The component is going and doing the call out to our Force.com blog to get the feed and present entries from that blog. So as we can see, we've got 3 separate entries specified here or shown here, and those are specified with the number of entries attribute. Well, let's take a look at the definition of this RSS feed component. If we can get that on the page at the same time. Okay, pretty close. Okay, so as you can see, here are our attributes, a title for the string that is presented inside of the page block that's output there where it says Force.com blog feed there on the page. The URL, this is the endpoint that we're going to be calling out to. And here we're taking the values for URL and for number of entries and passing them through to the component controller, the Apex class that backs this component, using the assign to attribute on the attribute component. So when the user specifies a URL, that is fed to the component, which is then fed to the controller. So let's take a look at the controller. And we have attributes in here, properties for the URL. Here's the string. Here's the URL. So that the setter is called on that property when the component is loaded with the value that was provided to it by the page author. In this case, feeds2.feedburner.com/sforceblog. That value was passed into the component, which was then passed into the component controller. And the component controller then, when it goes to render itself, iterates over these feed entries. So feed entries calls get feed entries inside of the component, which is right here, and returns a collection of feed entry objects. Feed entry objects are just a class defined in Apex that has the author, the created date, the title, and the body of the entry. And it provides a collection of those, iterates over them inside of the component, and outputs it to the screen. So from an author perspective, the person who's consuming this component, they need only understand the URL they're talking to, what title they want presented on their page that uses this controller and how many entries they want. And that simplicity is all they need to understand to add this powerful component to their page. All the heavy lifting and all the hard work was done by the component author behind the scenes, allowing that page author to be able to leverage all of that knowledge and experience.
Now that URL, that still has to be listed in the remote sites to allow the component to function.
That's right, Ron. So any call out from the Salesforce.com, the Force.com infrastructure requires that URL be specified in remote sites. You'll find remote sites under monitoring and under administration setup and setup, where this URL here, this domain, feeds2.feedburner.com, had to be added there such that a call out can be made from our infrastructure to the feeds2.feedburner.com website. So I'm going to get back into the presentation now. And as Ron showed earlier, the self-documenting nature, I didn't show this in the component reference, but this component is also listed in the component reference with the various values that I provided from my description. So the next and final aspect we're going to talk about here with respect to custom component development is providing a way for the component consumer, in this case the page author, as Ron likes to put it, to provide their own implementation for the body. So if you saw in the Hello World component and the input slider component, the RSS feed component, everything we've shown you so far has been self-closing in nature, similar to what you see here with the first example of Hello World under the component body bullet point. And when we say by component body, we're actually referring to the markup that's embedded between the open and closed tags. So in the second example of Hello World there, and the world in italics is what we're referring to as the component body. So the page author, the consumer of the component, who uses Hello World with the open and close rather than self-closing, can provide their own representation and markup structure that the author of the component can utilize to present back, and thus delegate more control to the consumer. One more concept to understand before we get into a couple of demos here is apex :variable. Apex :variable, like setting a variable in a class or any programming context, allows you to specify a handle to something else and refer to it by that handle. If you think about our iteration components, if you're familiar with those, if you're familiar with Visualforce, you can provide a value binding to a collection, and then each instance of the collection, you can have a variable that refers to that instance as you're iterating over it. In this case, I'm describing data list here, which creates an unordered or ordered list HTML element that will provide all the values that you've passed into it and let you specify what each one looks like using the body of the component and a variable. So those two concepts together can be leveraged inside of custom components, and I'll show that shortly. So in the Hello World example that Ron showed earlier, that example was self-closing. So here we're going to show here we're talking about the consumer, the page definition, providing a body, in this case italicizing the word world. If you recall before, it was just output directly. There was no control over its presentation. In this case, the component author, by providing component body instead of the name expression that you saw earlier, it provides the ability for the consumer to specify a component body implementation. In this case, as you see the rendered page at the bottom, it is italicized rather than being just non-italicized. So let's go back and take a look at a couple of demonstrations here. First, we're going to start with with the Hello World and transform that into something that utilizes the body. So as you can see right now, it's still using the self-closing nature because it does not provide a body. So let's go ahead and change this name to, just like you saw in the slide, component body. So by doing that, I've now basically said that right now I'm not doing anything with the name that's passed in. Instead, I am now going to make this a non-self-closing tag and provide an implementation. So now when I save this, instead of webinar, it's got Ron in italics. So again, if you take a look at that, the body that I passed in was referenced by the component author in the form of the Apex component body tag, allowing the consumer of this component, the page author, to specify what their implementation should look like. And as Ron mentioned, we do support the concept of default content. So let's say as the component author, now I want to actually provide a way for someone to do either specify the name attribute value or provide a body. So now by having something inside of the component body component in my custom component, if the consumer does not provide a value for the body but does provide a value for the name attribute, then it will return back to its former function. So if this all works as planned, it should go back to non-italicized and the value that was passed in.
So really this gives us the best of both worlds, the ability to define a default component body and let the page author override that with their own styles or content.
That's exactly right, Ron. So if we take that same concept that we just showed here to the RSS feed component. So if you recall, the RSS feed on this page here was self-closing in nature and provided the implementation that the component author specified. But let's say we want, as the component author, to delegate control over how that feed is presented back to the consumer. So we're just going to let the component do the heavy work of the call-out and taking that information from the call-out, parsing it, turning it into a collection of feed entry objects, and give those to the component consumer, in this case the page author, to present them however they want. So if we recall, the component definition for the feed, for the RSS feed component we're using in this demonstration, has a default implementation and no way to override that. So I've got a second component for an RSS feed, exact same attribute shape, exact same implementation, but I've wrapped it inside of component body. So now you get the best of both worlds, as Ron was saying. You get the default behavior implementation automatically, if that's what you want, by self-closing it and not providing a body. Or by providing a body, you can present the information however you want. So let's take a look at that. So this is the same feed information presented completely differently, utilizing the same component. The difference here in the implementation is that we're now iterating over the collection of feed entry objects ourselves. So the component author has provided a variable, just like we saw in data list or any of our other iteration components, by which I, the consumer, can specify a value for that variable and then use that to get a reference to the feed entry collection and iterate over it and display it however I want. So let's take a look at this again. Same three attributes we had before, title, URL, number of entries. This time we've added the variable. And this refers to the collection of feed entry objects. So if you recall, if you see down here, before we were iterating over feed entries. But if the consumer provides a body, we want to give them a handle back to that same collection. So we do that by publishing this variable attribute, giving it the same value as we iterate over inside of the component, the feed entries. And for the variable name itself, that is the value that's passed in by the component consumer, in this case, the page author. So
let me make sure I understand that. With that attribute, you're actually passing information not just from the page to the component, but now we're passing information from the component back to the page.
That's right. The information is there. We've just given the consumer a handle to get their hands on it, basically. So all that work was done, that difficult work of doing the call-out, writing the Apex code, parsing the HTTP XML call-out response, and converting that into feed entry objects and handing that back to the component consumer so that they can iterate over it however they want. In this case, we've got a custom component, another one that defines what each one is going to look like, and we're handing it off to each one off to that component for display.
So I see that you actually have a component called RSS feed, and it's invoking another component called myFeedEntry. Is it okay to have a component include another component, or?
Yeah. So this is why I refer to the person that consumes a component as a component consumer rather than a page author, because custom components can be comprised of standard components, any HTML or browser-capable markup and code, or more custom components. So you can build your own custom components, use them inside of other custom components, and leverage this bodies concept to provide delegation back and forth between the consumer, which is the page or another component author, and you yourself, the base component author.
Fantastic. That sounds very powerful. I'll have to adopt your terminology now that I understand how the components can include other components.
Always looking to help, Ron. So one thing, so that wraps up our demonstrations, and I wanted to go through a few design considerations. Is obviously, as you're building components that fit into a library of standard components and components from other component authors potentially, you want to take special care with the design of your components to make sure that they're easy to use, they avoid issues, and very intuitive as well. So one of the things, optimize for the recommended use pattern. So if you saw the feed entry, the output component that I had, that's pretty much going to be inside of an iteration. Design with that in mind, right? Try to avoid query and DML operations if that's going to be your general use cases inside of iterations, because those will pile up and affect your runtime governor limit consumption. For those of you who are familiar with writing Apex, you're aware of our governor limits. They will kick in when you do too many queries or DML statements, and putting components that do these types of things inside of iteration can be problematic. So try to avoid those operations if your component is expected to be used within iterations. Compensate for side effects. We do allow DML to be performed inside of a component controller, but we're all in one database here, generally speaking, when you're building a page. So when a component performs a DML operation, make sure that if there's partial page, I understand that Visualforce is one of the more attractive elements to it is its partial page processing nature and how easy it is to do partial page updates. So parts of the page can become stale very quickly if there's DML going on and partial page updating happening. So just make sure that you compensate for any side effects and make sure you expose to your author through the documentation capabilities we support what things you're doing DML on. Use standard components for CSS and JavaScript. So if you saw in the input slider example, I had style sheet and include script components in there. That will avoid duplication. We will only put one instance of that style sheet or one instance of that script, that reference to it inside of the head, no matter how many times it's referenced in a page. So that will make for a smaller payload and better structure in your page, because that will go in the head tag as well. Naming conventions refer to our standard components for their names and attributes as guidance. If your component does DML and you want to support partial page, you might choose a re-render attribute. For those of you familiar with our partial page and components and the way we do action binding and perform actions, each of those has a re-render attribute that allows the consumer to specify what areas of the page are re-rendered. And if you're doing DML, they may need to refresh part of the page that happens to present the same information that was just performed DML on in your component. So with that, I do want to turn it back over to Ron to kind of summarize and close this presentation out for us. So Ron, back to you.
Thanks, Andrew. That's a very powerful component overview, very powerful feature. But what we've seen is that custom components are easy to create simple markup and allow you to reuse that markup throughout your Visualforce pages or your site. It also simplifies maintenance. And with the self-documenting feature, your components can actually tell the developers, the people who author your pages, just how to use them. And they will allow you, components allow you to simplify these complex interactions, including algorithms, callouts, and SOQL statements. Now, what we've got is a bunch of questions from you. And so I've got a sheet up here. I'm going to show it to Andrew. These are questions from you guys in the audience. So now's a chance for you to go ahead and type your questions into the chat window, and Andrew's going to help us step through and answer these questions. So, okay. Developer resources. So while we're answering the questions, you can browse through our Developer Force website, developer.force.com, our Visualforce technical library, the discussion boards, and don't forget to mark your calendars for the May Tech Talk series. We're going to cover the summer platform release preview. And do we have the date for that?
May 14th. Next one.
May 14th. Okay, so yeah, mark your calendars for May 14th for the next webinar. We do have some components that you can look at out on the CodeShare site. That's developer.force.com. There's a tab called CodeShare. You'll find some examples, including the RSS feed component that we used to start some of these samples. There's also a little calendar example. You can see how components can be constructed from these Apex classes. So, on with the fun part, the questions. So, go ahead, Andrew. Start reading through those and see if you can help some of these folks.
Okay. So one of the questions is if there's any timeline for enabling Visualforce email templates to be used in mass email. That I do not know the definite answer to when that is going to be available. From a timeline perspective, the messaging team who owns Visualforce email templates has that on their roadmap. I do not know, however, what the timeline for that will be.
Okay, so we'll have to check back, and we'll put that up in the FAQ that we post with the all of your questions after the webinar is over.
So the next question is, I see that Visualforce creates the HTML and head elements for me, but am I able to define my own content within the head element, such as a JavaScript block? So you can use include script to include a referenced bit of JavaScript, and that is all we support. We don't support the ability to put your own JavaScript block, if you will, inside of your the head tag that we produce for you. And there's actually a pretty good reason for that. Static resources are the place where the JavaScript should be housed. Your functions that refer to things in the page, that creates a fairly tight coupling between your page and that JavaScript and makes it more difficult for that to be factored out into a static resource. Static resources are the feature where I was storing all of my script that I got from the EXT.js library in the input slider example. And if you can factor your JavaScript in such a way that it gets its hands on, as an argument, the DOM ID or the component ID using our supported approach, you can put more and more of your otherwise static markup into static resources, which are browser cached and will improve the performance and maintainability of your application. Okay, let's see. Going through the questions here. Can a component be reused after install and reused in an extension package with a different namespace? So just like any other programmatic element or type like we have in Apex, packaging, you can use our packaging mechanism to distribute your own custom components. They will get tagged with the namespace if these are managed in a managed package or an extension package that is also managed. And these things, there is a contract that we force you to enter into by using the access attribute. So if you look at component and attribute, they both have access attributes on them. When you specify them as global, they can be used outside of your namespace by consumers, either from an extension or from the organization that installs your base package, but only when they're global. And then we have rules about deprecating or changing the shape, just like we do in Apex for classes. Can we link Visualforce page with record types? Not sure exactly what that question is. There's an override mechanism inside of that's the Force.com platform supports for overriding various things that are sometimes record type dependent, but the override is global in nature and happens before record types come into play. So there isn't a way to override at the record type mapping level, if that's the question. Are there any limitations to Visualforce pages that are utilized in sites versus those that are internal? There are some things to be aware of. I'm not aware of any limitations. There are certainly things to be aware of when you use, for example, a standard controller. That has to be, the object for it has to be supported by the guest user that is the site user. Just like any other user or profile, the site has the similar concepts. And you have to understand that certain things in Visualforce were designed such like navigation and things, the default navigation when you click Save in the standard controller, for example. These types of things are not site aware, so they're just things to keep in mind. Will we get the source for the examples as well as the presentation slides? Well, I can certainly speak to the source for the examples. One of them is already up, as Ron was mentioned on the slide you see right now. The RSS feed component is up. We should be able to get the rest of them up. There may be something we have to check into with the EXTJS library reference, however, before we can post that one. As far as the presentation slides, Ron, can you take that one?
Yeah, we'll have a recording of this webinar available, and we'll try to get the slides up on that same page. It'll take a couple of days for the webinar recording to appear, but it'll be on developer.force.com.
Okay. Can you lock a custom component so that other people cannot change it, similar to the managed packages in apps? Yes. So if you publish a component through the App Exchange in a managed package, the shape of that component will not change. And also the component will be obfuscated. The markup that's contained within the component will be obfuscated. The consumer will not be able to see the markup. They'll only be able to see the attributes. Which goes to sort of the next question. Can you obfuscate a page? Visualforce page code? Page code, no, not today. Only component code. What are the Apex limits we should be aware of when Visualforce page loads with custom components on it? So Visualforce runs in there are 3, I believe, contexts for Apex limits. There's the trigger limit. There is the testing limit, and there is the web service / Visualforce / execute anonymous limit. Those all 3 contexts share the same limit context, and Visualforce sits in that. So it is different from triggers. All the same types of limits apply. There are different numbers. You can refer to the Apex language reference where there's a table that describes each of those limit values for the Visualforce context. So then one question is, can you talk about unit and test coverage for the component? So we don't have a way to test component markup today. However, you can and must, in some cases, test your controller code. So in the example of the RSS feed where there was a component controller, that's written in Apex. That Apex code needs to have code for Jhana just like any other Apex class. What are the plans for including inline editing within Visualforce pages? There is actually another team that is responsible for adding that support to Visualforce, and I am not sure what their timing-wise is on their roadmap. I know it is not in the summer release, and it is probably not in the release after, but we'll add that to the list of questions a la the mass email Visualforce email templates question. Are there any advantages for internal developers using Visualforce versus Java? Why would I want to build something in Visualforce versus Java? Well, so currently, Salesforce will only run the technologies that Salesforce supports, and that includes Apex Code and Visualforce for the user interface. So if you build it in Java, then you would need to also maintain the servers on which that interface technology runs, whatever you use Java there, either whether it's servlets or JSPs or JSF or whatever framework that you utilize. To build your interface, you would have to maintain that in your own servers. So that is a pretty significant advantage for a lot of people who like the concept of cloud computing and leveraging our infrastructure. UMYB believes Visualforce pages as homepage components. When can we use components in page layout? So today you can use Visualforce pages in a page layout. There is no mechanism in a page layout to provide attribute values to a component, which is the primary reason why we stick to the page as the construct for including inside of a page layout definition. You can do the same thing today with a homepage component by using an HTML area type component and creating an iframe to it. A more formal support for Visualforce pages on the home page is being worked on by the same team that would be responsible for inline editing. But again, I don't know the time frame for that delivery. If DML works inside of a component, why is there an allow DML attribute for Apex:component? And I get an error when upserting inside component controller. Okay, so if you add allow DML on your component definition, the upsert process inside of your component controller should not error in that case. The reason why we require this is because we want to make sure that the component author understands the impacts of creating a component that performs DML operations on the same database that the page author is writing queries against, doing things with, so that we don't have any side effect issues where you might be doing DML on something that the user is currently editing in another part of the page that included your component. That would then make their save fail because we have collision detection, and that will obviously turn into a collision detection issue that could be presenting information that's stale. By saying allow DML equal true, that gives us an opportunity to convey to the component author one final time, that these important aspects of performing DML in your component controller. And that's pretty much the bulk of the questions we've gotten so far.
Yes, please note that we will combine all of these questions and answers and post them in our FAQ. And thank you for your time in attending today. And thank you, Andrew, for coming in and talking about some of the advanced topics of Visualforce components. And as you work with components and as you have more questions, please go ahead and post your questions to the discussion boards on developer.force.com. And if you'd like to see some examples of some more sites and components that people have built, we have a gallery of sites that's located at developer.force.com/sitesgallery, SITESGALLERY. You'll see a bunch of different Visualforce and Force.com sites examples that have been built, and you can get some ideas for building your own components and your own Force.com sites. So thank you very much for your time and your attendance, and we'll post these questions and the webinar recording on developer.force.com in just a few days. Thank you very much.